Hello and welcome to this video in the Intersight Managed Mode Expert series. In this video, I will be showing you how the Intersight operating system installation feature can be used. To get started, I will just show you a quick example before we discuss the details of this feature. To kick off the process, we're just gonna select Install Operating System for a server, which automatically selects the server. We could select multiple at the same time, but for now, let's just go and select an operating system. Then we're going to continue with the configuration of this operating system. So we're just going to go with this basic configuration. We're going to give it an IP address, net mask, and all the other settings that are required to set up the OS. Now, these settings will then be used during the installation process to automatically configure, in this case VMware, for us. So once we finish that, we can then go ahead and go to the next step. Now we're going to select the server configuration utility, which is actually going to automate the configuration for us. And in the last step, we're going to select the install target, in this case the local disk. And then we're just going to kick off the installation process. This, in turn, will actually start a workflow in the background. And by clicking on this icon on the top right, we can actually monitor the progress of that workflow. We're also showing the KVM session in the bottom right. So you can see that the Cisco SCU is actually completely automating the installation of the server. There's no manual intervention involved. Basically, the OS will be installed, and a little bit later you will see that it's going to boot up with the IP that we actually provided during the configuration. Now that we understand what the OS install feature does, let's actually look at all of the options that we have and all of the choices we need to make. First of all, we need to decide what operating system we want to install. We support VMware, Windows Server, or several flavors of Linux. Then we need to talk about the installation method. Just now I've shown you the Cisco method, which requires the SU to perform the installation. I can also perform an SU installation using the custom method. More on both of those later. If I don't want to automate the installation externally, I can also embed the installation into the image myself, in which case I do not need the SU image. Finally, I need to decide where I want to install the operating system. On a local disk, or on a fiber channel or iSCSI SAN. Now, let's look at all of the preparation steps we need to perform an OS installation, starting with the management mode of the server. Today, we support OS installation on both Intersight managed servers and standalone servers. We can verify that by going on the server and checking the management mode of the server. So here we can see this server is Intersight managed. This server is standalone. Both of those are supported. And finally, we can see this server is managed by UCS Manager and not supported for OS install. The next hardware aspect we need to look at is the system generation. Now, for this, we want to use our matrix to verify the support. So we go to the Intersight Help Center, and there we look for the appropriate page on operating system installation. So we go here, and then we click on the operating system installation overview. On this page, you can see all of the server generations as well as the supported firmware releases. We can use this information to actually verify if the server is supported in the server view. So here we can see the server generation. Now to view the firmware version, we can either go and edit the view to include the firmware version as well, which would allow us to verify it from here, or we can just click on the server and look at the firmware version in there. Both ways will allow us to verify the firmware version to make sure we have the minimum required release. Next, we want to verify the license level of the server. That's a very simple check in the server view. We just click on the server, and in the left-hand column we can see the license tier. If this is not advantage, we can adjust this using the actions, and we can set the license tier to at least advantage. For the next check, it depends on whether you are doing a local installation or a SAN installation. For the local installation, we need to verify that we have a compatible RAID controller. That means that we're either going to need an M.2 RAID controller, like in this example, or we're going to need a regular RAID controller, like in this example. If you are going to do a SAN-based installation, you need to verify that you have a Cisco VIC in your server. You can see that based on the model number, for example the UCSB MLOM, or you look at the vendor information. And the last thing, we're just going to check our disk size. Now, for the SAN, you need to check it there, but if you're doing a local installation, you can check it in the inventory by going to the storage controller and then viewing the physical and virtual drives. For legacy boot mode, you can have at most 2 TB in size, and in general you need to make sure that your disk is large enough to accommodate whatever operating system you want to install on it. Now let's look at the minimum required configuration for your server. The first thing would be the boot policy. You can decide between UEFI boot and legacy boot. Just keep in mind that if you're using secure boot, it is not supported for all operating system types. Other than that, the only thing left to do is to define a boot target for wherever you want to boot your operating system from. We're not going to go into detail about all of these policy configurations. You can check out our other videos if you want to learn more about all the details of each policy. The next policy is the IMC access policy. This is only relevant for Intersight managed systems. Essentially, we need to configure how the management network can connect to the file share on which we have our images. Only in-band configurations are supported. We will have to provide a VLAN on which the connectivity will flow, as well as an IP address. The IP address is derived from an IP pool. So we're not statically assigning the address, we're defining a range of IP addresses from which each server can pull a management IP for its own configuration. If you are doing a local installation, you will have to verify the RAID controller configuration as well as the virtual drive. To do that, we are going to create a storage policy. You can either build your RAID using M.2 disks, or you use regular disks with a regular RAID controller, in which case you will have to provide a drive group which selects the disks that will be part of the RAID group, and then you have to build a virtual drive which is set to boot mode. You can then go ahead and verify all of that by going to the server inventory and looking at the storage controllers tab. In there, you can click on your respective controller and verify that the virtual drive is there and in a healthy state, so optimal, and that it's bootable. If, on the other hand, you're doing a SAN-based installation, you will need a SAN connectivity policy to configure your SAN network. Now, that means you will have to configure virtual HBAs on your VIC card. The configuration details for all of this can be found in one of our other IMM Expert Series videos. Every server will also require LAN connectivity. If you are doing iSCSI boot, you will also have to configure IQNs. Otherwise, it is a similar configuration to SAN, where you have to provide the VNICs. All of the configuration details for that can be found in our other IMM Expert Series videos. This is just a minimum configuration. You can add more settings to configure the server based on your needs. Now, let's have a look at something else. We also need to provide files that we're going to use during the installation. First, we need to prepare an operating system image. Now, the most important thing is to check the compatibility of the image. Each management mode has its own list of supported operating system images and versions. So compare the management mode to that list to make sure that the operating system is supported. If you are doing an SU-based installation, you will also have to prepare that image. You can find the minimum supported version on the same page. The compatibility depends on the management mode and server generation. If you want to download the image, just go to Cisco Software Central. There, an easy way to find it is to just click Browse All, look for Servers, Unified Computing, look for your server type, so for example UCSX, select the server, and then you can download the SU image from there. You should also have a look at the release notes of the SU itself. That will give you valuable information about which release of the SU is required to support a certain operating system version. To summarize, you should make sure that the SU has the minimum required version for the server, as well as the operating system image that you want to deploy. Now that you have prepared the images, you need to upload them to a file share in your environment. We support multiple types of file share: NFS, CIFS, HTTPS. File shares are a complicated topic because there's so many different settings for each different type of file share. And it's impossible to give you a generic advice for each type of file share. Just keep in mind that if the mount on your server is failing, file share could be a likely cause, and reviewing all the settings is important to make sure that the mount can succeed. Please also make sure that your network connectivity between your file share and your server is set up properly. If you are doing a custom mode installation, you will have to build your own kickstart file. For that, go into the Cisco documentation and look for the guide on building a custom kickstart file. So you have the Cisco mode where you get the kickstart file built for you, or you can do an installation in custom mode, in which case you can use your own placeholders, including conditions, and importantly, there's also internal placeholders that need to be used. If you want to get started with an example, you can just use our sample kickstart files as a template and then customize them to your needs. There's different examples for different operating system types that you can use. The last thing we need to do before we can get started with the installation is linking all images to Intersight. To do that, we go to System and then we go to Software Repository. In there, we can add the links for OS images, SU images, and OS configuration files. Now, for an OS image link, we just click the Add OS image link. Now, on the first screen, we have to select the type of file share we have: NFS, CIFS, or HTTPS. Then we just add a file location for whatever file share we chose, and we configure all the other options that are necessary. On the next page, we provide a name for the image, and then we add information like vendor and version. So for example, in this case, we're gonna say this image is VMware 70U2. This will actually determine how the image shows up for us later on. We'll have to do the same thing for the SU links. So we click Add, we select our type of file share, add the image location, and then on the next page, we define a name for that SU image, and then we enter the version. We can also add information about the supported models, but this information is just for our own benefit and is not used to restrict what we can do with this image. If you have your own kickstart file, you can upload it through the OS configuration files. In there, you then have to provide a name for your kickstart file. Then you provide the vendor of the operating system that it can be used for, as well as the versions that this kickstart file can be used for. And that's it. Then you can use the kickstart file as part of your installations. Now we have finished all the preparation steps and we can get started with an installation. Let's have a look at how to run a UI-driven OS installation. The first step will be selecting one or more servers and then clicking on Install Operating System. In there we can add more servers to the selection if we want to. Otherwise we just continue with the selection we have right now. So just keep in mind, you can always do multiple servers at the same time with this feature as well. Next, we'll have to select the operating system that we want to install on the server or servers. So we're going to be presented with this list of OS images from the software repository. We just select one and continue. Now, if your OS does not show up, check the organization on your server and the organization on your OS image link. If the image link and the server do not share an organization, then the image link will not show up. With the operating system selected, we will now have to add the configuration. Remember that there are 3 different types of installation modes. We have the Cisco mode, we have the custom mode, and we have the embedded mode. So for the Cisco mode, you will be presented with this pre-made configuration file, which basically does everything for you. And you will only have to add the variables. So for example, here you can see the variables like the IP address and then the corresponding entry in the field. So we don't need to worry about this kickstart file. We only need to fill in the variables for each server. So we're just going to populate this one by one until we're done, and then we can continue. So Cisco mode is the easiest option to install your operating system on a server. If you want to use your own kickstart file, we're going to go with the custom mode, where you can upload your own configuration. So you can see here, this is your own kickstart file. And basically the placeholders that you put into that kickstart file will also show up in this form, and we will have to define them per server. So again, we're just going to add all of those settings. Now, the complicated part, or the more complicated part about this, is that you will have to verify your own kickstart file and make sure that it works. The last way that you get to install is the embedded mode, in which case the configuration is completely embedded in the operating system. For this installation, we will be continuing with the Cisco mode that we filled out in the beginning. Next, we will have to also select the SU image. This is similar to what we did for the OS image, and also keep in mind that the organization needs to match for this one as well. Before we can start our installation, we need to choose an install target. The simplest option to do it is to use the pre-fill option, which gives you the option to just select one of the targets and it will fill out all the settings for you for all of your servers. Otherwise, you can choose per server. For example, I can look at the local disk and then choose whatever local virtual drive I have. If you have configured a virtual drive but it does not show up, you can verify in the server inventory by looking on the storage controller that your virtual drive should belong to. Your drive should show up in there. It should be in optimal status, and it should be bootable. If you're booting from an external storage, you need to provide the initiator and target information. So here for Fiber Channel, as well as for iSCSI. Now, for the server, you can find the interface information by going to Inventory and then navigating to the network adapter that you're using. Remember, this has to be a VIC. So in the Interfaces tab, you can actually see all of your VNICs and VHBAs. That was all the steps. For installation, we're just going to use a local drive, just as an example. Now, we're going to get one more summary screen and then we can kick off the installation. We can basically divide the installation itself into 4 main steps. If you want to follow along with this process, you can just launch the KVM or tunnel KVM on a server. The difference is that the tunnel KVM does not require local connectivity to work. Now, let's follow along with the first step. The server will be mounting and booting the SU image, which will drive the rest of the installation. We can also follow along in the Requests tab. This will show you all the individual steps that the workflow is taking to install the operating system. Now be aware that this will be taking quite a bit of time, but well, what happens if something goes wrong? Well, here we've got our first error message for step 1, which is basically that an image failed to mount. Now let's have a look at the KVM, and here we can actually verify that ourselves by trying to manually map a virtual media drive. We just use the same settings that we use for the software repository at the file location, and we try to mount it. Now, if we get an error message in here that basically confirms that the image mount is not working for some reason, so you need to go back and fix your connectivity between the file share and the server. And once you've done that, you can retest it here to make sure that your mount is working. You can actually confirm that by clicking on Tools and Stats, which will show you that the mount is actually transferring data. Okay, that's step 1 done. Now the SU will be performing its setup, which again you can just follow along. So you can see that the SU is going through all the steps, parsing the configuration file and so on. If you're getting errors in there, it's probably that your configuration file has some problems. Then the OS image will be mounted. Again, you can get the same type of mount error that you've actually seen before. In the last step, the actual OS installation will now be performed on autopilot. So you can actually see that VMware is booting here, it is being configured, and after another reboot, it will actually boot up with the IP that we gave it in the configuration. This is all well and good if you're only trying to install a single server, but if you want to install multiple servers at the same time, you can look at the CSV-based installation. So in this document, you will actually find an example that you can use for a CSV-based installation. So basically what that means is you can specify all of your servers in a single file like this, and then you can use that as an input for your OS installation. So here you can modify parameters like IPs and so on, and then in install operating system, it's important that you trigger it from the top there. You can select configuration via file, upload your file, and it will auto-populate all of the values for you. And now you can install multiple servers at the same time. Okay, so here you can see we actually have 2 servers with all the individual configuration based on that CSV file that I've shown you before. Now, once we click install, it will kick off separate OS install processes for both servers that we had in the CSV file. This will just do the operating system installation. If you also want to do other parts of the server installation, you can use another mechanism. For that, go to Cloud Orchestrator, and there you can create a new workflow, automate your entire server deployment. This will require Advantage licenses or higher. So in here you can give the workflow a name. So for example, my server onboarding. Then we can go to the designer and we can start building our automation. So essentially we're looking for a workflow called operating system install. We drag and drop it in there, and we can then populate inputs that will be run on that server. So for example, we can select a server to run the automation against. But to really make use of it, we define it as a workflow input. So whenever you run this automation, you will be asked for which server should be installed. This input contains all of the inputs relevant for the OS configuration. Let's also map that to a workflow input, so we will be asked for both of those values when we execute the workflow. So let's save, and then let's click execute to actually run the workflow. So we will be asked for all of those inputs for the server, OS image, and so on. So we're going to have to fill them out as if we are doing a manual installation. Now, hold on. We're still just installing a single server here, so what's the real benefit? Well, I'm just showing you the simple version first with a single server, and then we're coming to a version where we're going to install multiple servers at the same time and also doing other things at the same time. Just to give you some examples of what you could be doing, you could start with a completely blank server, create a profile for it, deploy the profile on the server, then you could do the OS install. You could also do things like configuring the SAN, configuring the LAN, or doing any other kind of configuration, like for example VMware or whatever else you can think of that serves your use case. Now, with the inputs populated, we can then go ahead and start executing this workflow. This will kick off a workflow like we've seen before, but now we have a slightly different interface where we can follow along. Now for a single task, this doesn't make much of a difference, but once we're executing multiple tasks, this is going to give us more options for troubleshooting. Now, after some time, server installation is done. Perfect. So now, let's actually go and do something more meaningful. So here we've got a parallel loop, and in this parallel loop, we're going to install multiple servers at once. So we're going to start by populating inputs, and here this workflow is doing things like allowing us to select templates, allowing us to select VMware clusters. So we're actually doing a full setup from an empty server all the way up to joining it into a VMware cluster. So a few more inputs that are going to be generic for all servers, like the root password. But then in this example, we have also added server selection input, which basically allows us to select one or multiple servers on which this workflow is run. And this is just one way of doing things. We could also select servers automatically based on tags, for example. But in this case, we're selecting them manually and we're providing IP addresses manually. You could also, for example, use DHCP or an IPAM as part of your workflow. When we execute, this will actually spawn two child workflows. So basically two processes that are each going to install one server. And when we look at the details, we see all the individual steps it's doing. Like for example, right now we are creating a server profile from a template, and then we are deploying that server profile onto our servers. So we really start with completely blank servers, and now they're configured. And for the next step, we are then going to install the operating system. Well, we already know this step, so pretty simple. And then once the operating system is available, we're going to take that ESXi host and we're going to join it to our existing cluster. If you wanted, you could also do the cluster setup as part of this workflow. Then we're also going to add the DVS, and now we have done a complete installation of a VMware host. Using orchestration also allows us to use one really awesome capability, rollbacks. Essentially, all of the stuff that we did can be undone by a rollback operation. So it will remove the profiles, remove the hosts from VMware. Any kind of action that can be undone is part of this rollback operation. So we're actually cleaning up the servers again. So if you installed them and you don't need them anymore, you can just use the rollback and you're back to having completely blank servers ready for a new setup. This was just a quick peek at orchestration. We actually have a full video series focused only on orchestration. I hope this was helpful for you, and now have fun using OS install in Intersight.